This is CBN NewsWatch.
Welcome to this special Thanksgiving edition of CBN NewsWatch. I'm Charlene Aaron. We all know the story of the Plymouth Pilgrims and their first Thanksgiving celebration in the New World. And you may have heard about the friendly Indian named Squanto who helped them survive after that first terrible winter when more than half of the Pilgrims perished. But have you heard the whole story of Squanto? He's the Native American who walked out of the woods and into the Pilgrims' lives one day in 1621, speaking perfect English. It's an amazing tale of a 12-year-old boy kidnapped and sold into slavery in Europe, and then years later is planted right back in the middle of this pilgrim adventure. Here's the true story of Squanto, one that is as powerful and history-changing as the story of Joseph in the Old Testament.
Thy help cometh from the Lord, who keepeth Israel. The Lord of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. He shall become thy shade upon thy right hand. He shall protect thy incomings and outgoings.
In the winter of 1620, the Pilgrims at Plymouth are struggling to survive. The long journey to America has taken a heavy toll on the weary travelers. They were not equipped to deal with the many challenges in the New World, and nearly half perished in the early days of their journey. In the midst of their struggle, they humbled themselves and turned their hearts to God, praying for His mercy and providence to protect them and establish their community.
Dear Lord, find us in the wilderness.
Their prayers would be answered through a series of divine and tragic events that occurred years earlier in the life of a young native boy named Squanto. It was the early 1600s in the area that would soon be called Massachusetts. Squanto and his tribe were curious about the white men from across the ocean who would visit their shoreline from time to time. When the ships arrived, Squanto and others went to investigate. During one of those visits, an English sailor, Thomas Hunt, not satisfied with his income and looking for dishonest gain, came to the region looking for opportunities. Hunt broke trust with the tribes and took Squanto and 23 other natives aboard his ship. The natives were forced into the ship's hull and taken across the ocean to Spain to be sold into slavery. Distrust for the white man grew into Squanto's heart during his travel across the sea, and he wondered why the Great Spirit would allow him to be so mistreated. Squanto did not know what his future would hold and wondered if he would ever see home again. Upon landing in Spain, the slave traders sold several natives. But Squanto was set free by a group of Spanish friars who disrupted the event before Squanto's sale. The friars took him in, and he lived among them. He learned how to speak Spanish and about their Christian faith, about the one true God of the Bible and His Son Jesus. They taught him their self-sustaining lifestyle, planting and harvesting crops. Squanto grew to love and trust the monks, and life was good with them. But his desire to return home to his people, his tribe, never left him. He longed for the familiar places, the family and friends from whom he had been so violently taken. He prayed to God that somehow, someday, he would be able to return to his tribe. God heard his prayers. The friars devised a plan to get Squanto back to his homeland and to his beloved tribe. It would not be easy, and it would take several years, but their plan was put into action. He made his way to England, where he lived with and worked for an English businessman named John Slaney. Slaney and his Newfoundland company were looking for opportunities to expand trade with the New England natives. Squanto had learned how to speak English fluently and would earn his way back to America, working for the company as a translator. Hope sprung up in Squanto as he believed he would soon be home with his tribe. He remained in England for a few more years, but Squanto's hope never died. He'd been places that few in his tribe could even imagine, and he longed to tell them about all that he'd done and seen. Finally, in 1619, everything was in place. Once more, he sailed across the ocean. This time, his destination was home. With his feet finally back on familiar soil, Squanto ran towards his village, excited to be reunited with his loved ones. His heart was crushed by what he discovered. Plague had ravaged his people only months earlier, and everyone had died. Of his tribe, only Squanto remained. Confused and alone, he pondered his existence, his purpose. Why had he endured the years of struggle and false hope in strange lands? Why did he make it all the way home, only to find such devastation? Thoughts of death were not far from him. He was accepted into the neighboring Wampanoag tribe, but in his heart, he knew he did not belong. Word came to Squanto that a group of European settlers had set up their camp on the very site of his former village. They were English, Pilgrims. He spoke their language and knew their ways. He saw how they struggled to survive, how they prayed to Jesus for help, for hope. His heart went out to them, and he longed to help them. With the blessing of the Wampanoag chief, Squanto made his presence known. The Pilgrims were filled with fear at the sight of him. So far, relations with the native tribes had not been easy, and tensions were high. As Squanto neared the entrance of the village, he raised his voice and spoke in perfect English.
My name is Squanto, and this is Big Bear. We mean you no harm.
The Pilgrims were amazed at the sight and sound of him. They welcomed him in, and he made his home with them. In the spring, Squanto taught the Pilgrims what he had learned from his own tribe and his time with the friars in Spain, how to plant crops and fertilize seeds. He was their interpreter and helped make peace with the Wampanoag and other tribes in the area. Before long, he was more at home with the settlers than he was anywhere else. He lived with them and in many ways became one of them. In the fall of 1621, the harvest was abundant. The Pilgrims were thriving. God had answered their fervent prayers through Squanto, and in the process, healed his broken heart. In November of that year, the Pilgrim leaders held a great feast, giving thanks to God for providing for their needs. William Bradford, the leader of the Pilgrims, asked Squanto to invite the Wampanoag tribe to the Thanksgiving celebration. They came and joined the party for 3 days, and there was peace and joy in the region.
Brothers and sisters, we gather today with thankfulness in our hearts. The Lord in His mercy has planted us and established us here. We have seen times of adversity and mourning and scarcity, but now the Lord shows us a time of harvest and plenty. And we are thankful for Squanto, who has joined us in our pilgrimage here to worship God freely. His path has not been easy, but the Lord was with him and sustained him and brought him to this place before us. And he has been an answer to our prayers here, that the Lord would provide for us, provide a way by his mighty hand. And the hand of God is with you and has never forsaken you. The psalmist tells us, "Give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever." And today, with our friends and our families and our neighbors, we will declare this a great day of thanksgiving, and we will celebrate, and we will praise the Lord for his mercy to us and his presence with us. Amen.
Without Tisquantum's help, the Pilgrims may not have survived those early brutal years. Tisquantum put his faith in the God of the Bible and lived with the Pilgrims until his death. He became known as Squanto, and his legend lives on today in the story of the first Thanksgiving, the Native American man whom God used to answer a desperate prayer from a desperate people.
A few years before Squanto rescued the Pilgrims of Plymouth, Massachusetts, another Native American some 600 miles to the south changed the course of history for a different English settlement. Her name was Pocahontas, a member of the Powhatan tribe, and the settlement was Jamestown, Virginia. That story coming up next. On this Thanksgiving Day, we take you on a journey back in history to Jamestown, Virginia, in the year 1607. English settlers and Native Americans had an uneasy truce. One young woman lived between the two worlds. Her name was Pocahontas.
She fascinates generations of people across the globe. Disney's portrayal of her captured imaginations. But who was Pocahontas?
She's a mystery. She's made out of English words which have their purposes, and there's almost no neutral Pocahontas.
There is no black and white on this. You know, there's a whole lot of gray, a million shades of gray.
Pocahontas didn't write anything down. There was no written language of her people. So everything we know of Pocahontas comes to us through the observations of Englishmen.
One has to try and find out more than just the Disney version.
They made her like a cartoon character, like she might have been some kind of legend or something that didn't really exist.
She was an essential part of the Powhatan Confederacy.
We were taught that she betrayed her people.
And what about John Smith?
Smith, he's pretty quick to publicize himself.
John Smith is probably the person who is most involved in creating the Pocahontas of legend, and it's hard to tell the legend from the truth in his writings.
John Smith wrote that Pocahontas rescued him during captivity and saved his life, a claim doubted by many scholars.
He has 3 accounts of his time in Jamestown and his captivity there, and it's only in the 3rd time of writing, 1624, that he talks about her as the person who rescued him.
Legend says, she was Powhatan's favorite daughter. That's why he saved John Smith, because she fell in love and asked for it. Not so much.
I believe that was a part of the Powhatan adoption ceremony.
The rescue is, I think, improbable, but of course there's only one person who wrote anything down. There's only one witness, and that's John Smith. In real life, she married John Rolfe. In the legend, she will forever be in love with John Smith, because John Smith told us so.
Pocahontas isn't a myth, but why is her story relevant to us today?
We have something in the Native culture called full circle. So as if you plant a seed, it comes to full maturity. And that's how I feel time has begun here. We're coming back to the full circle of time.
This is a story about Pocahontas and a man who changed her life forever. But his name isn't John, it's Alexander. In the early years of the Jamestown settlement, the colonists set up trade with the Algonquin Indians and their chief, Powhatan. Powhatan's territory extended hundreds of miles.
They really landed right in the middle of Powhatan's empire.
When the English came here, they used their points of reference in the way that they had government structured, so they called him a king, but he was really a high chief. And he had about 32 tribes, we think, and there was a werewance over each one of them, or a werewance squaw, and they would be like advisors to him. So it was really pretty representative of kind of like what we have today.
In his negotiations with the English, it's likely that Powhatan saw opportunity.
He wanted the metal tools, the arms. He didn't have any of those things. Could have revolutionized life in Powhatan. So he adopted them in like he would have any other tribe, so that he would have access to those resources, because it would strengthen his political position in the state.
Ungapo. Hello. Ungapo. Corn. We need the corn.
The settlers were dependent on the natives for food, but also wanted Powhatan and his people to come under their control.
The colony was struggling. It's the story of all the English colonies. They couldn't take hold, they couldn't live, they couldn't feed themselves.
In 1611, after several years of conflict, Alexander Whitaker arrived in the midst of this turmoil. The Anglican minister left a comfortable life in England to come to the New World.
He was a young man, very, very well educated, comes from a long family of scholars. Uncle Lawrence was a noted Anglo-Saxon scholar. Uncle Alexander, besides being a great fisherman, is also the accidental inventor of bottled beer. But yeah, very well-educated family, very well-educated young man, went to Eton, went to Cambridge. This is the man who's coming over here. He's going to have church twice a day, 3 times on Sunday. Sunday's when he's going to preach his sermon. But morning and evening, he will have a service here, and everyone will attend. That is the law.
Alexander Whitaker's concern was conversion of the Native Americans, as well as pastoring the English that were there and reproving them for their failure to live up to the gospel when they didn't.
When we look at Whitaker, we see not John Calvin. We don't see Calvin thumping on his pulpit, screaming about, fire and brimstone coming down. We see more Billy Graham, who is reasoning. He's saying, look, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it.
He recognized that the Native Americans in Virginia are not a whole lot different than the English were back before they knew Christianity, when England was essentially a conglomeration of various tribes.
He's looking at them and saying, okay, they're like us. They're part of God's creation, and they don't know the true way. We need to show them this. We need to bring them into the right path.
In 1612, Whitaker wrote Good News from Virginia, a sermon he preached and then sent to the colony's sponsors in London. The sermon was based on a passage from Ecclesiastes 11. Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again. In spite of the colony's economic losses, the sermon moved the founders of the colony so much that they published it throughout England.
Jamestown was a commercial venture in the sense that people invested money in it, sort of like venture capitalists, expecting to get money back.
Wherefore, I do not marvel that there have been great discouragements and many adversaries of this plantation. For the devil, knowing that where Christ wins, he looseth.
Whitaker castigated the English who were investing only from a monetary standpoint. He said, we need colonists to come who will really live the Christian life and have a concern for being used of God as catalysts for the conversion of the Native Americans.
Whitaker's commitment to building good relations with the Native Americans was about to be tested.
Things were about to heat up between the colonists and the Powhatan tribe. When we come back, a sea captain hatches a plan to kidnap Pocahontas and hold her for ransom. Pocahontas loved both her own people, the Powhatan, and the English settlers who loved her right back. Then something happened that would make Pocahontas feel betrayed by both.
The English didn't understand the codes of respect and honor that the Powhatans lived by. So when they would go in and take up land without asking, it was an affront to him and an insult. And so he retaliated. And that's when things started to turn, when they were taking land that he didn't give them. And he actually said, "Why take by force that which would be given you for the asking?"
It fairly quickly broke down in some difficult situations, and there were people killed on both sides, hard feelings, and captives taken.
Chief Powhatan, he's as sharp as any European monarch. He's on the ball. He keeps the English off balance. He keeps them guessing. He allies with them when he wants to. He fights them when he has to.
At this time, the Native Americans, the Powhatan Indians, had a number of English in captivity and also some guns.
The colonists wanted to convince Powhatan to return the English hostages and weapons. A sea captain named Samuel Argall came up with a plan. He decided to kidnap the chief's favorite daughter and hold her for ransom.
Powhatan withdrew into his territories, and the English had to try and bring some pressure on him. And Samuel Argall, who was going up the river to the Patawomecs, who were a neighboring set of Indians, somewhat under the domination of Powhatan, but a bit independent as well. And he heard that Pocahontas was with the Patawomecs.
He was able to negotiate, to some degree under threat, what essentially was the betrayal of Pocahontas. It was a betrayal of the trust that she had in the English, and it was a betrayal on the part of her Native American friends also, who did trick her so that she would end up going on the ship and thus be kidnapped.
She really became this pawn in the middle of this life or death game that was taking place between these two groups of people who I think had good reason to deeply mistrust the motives of the other one.
Pocahontas, whose given name was Matoaka, was no stranger to the colonists. As a little girl, she brought gifts of food to Jamestown. She also played games with the English boys, living up to her nickname, Pocahontas, which means naughty or mischievous one.
Pocahontas seemed to have been beloved by the colonists and by her peoples, the Powhatan, as well. I think the Englishmen saw this innocent child. You know, this wasn't someone who was going to attack you or anything like that. And I think similarly to the Powhatan, this was obviously an example of the innocence and goodness of their people and a symbol of her father's sort of benevolent power.
I think her personality was light. I think she was obviously full of love and generosity and grace. So she was already royal before anybody ever called her a princess.
When Chief Powhatan heard that his favorite daughter had been captured, He released the prisoners, but told the settlers that all the guns were broken or lost. Sir Thomas Dale, the governor of the Virginia colony, didn't believe Powhatan's story, and he refused to release Pocahontas. In the spring of 1613, Dale sent Pocahontas to the neighboring settlement of Henricus under the care of his trusted friend, the Reverend Alexander Whitaker.
I was reading from Matthew.
Whitaker spent the next year teaching Pocahontas about the Bible.
Just one of my favorites. It is called the Sermon on the Mount.
When Alexander Whitaker arrived, he would have had the Book of Common Prayer with this revised catechism. He would have had a Bible, probably the Geneva Bible. So this is what Alexander Whitaker would have taught Pocahontas. And she, in question and answer form, would have learned all the basic doctrines about who is God, who is Jesus Christ, what it means to be a Christian.
And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven."
It's not conversion at the point of an axe or a spear or a sword. This is a logical conversion. You know, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it. Paul talks about the unknown God. He finds the altar and he says, this is the altar to the unknown God. He says, I'm going to tell you about that fella. This is what I see Whitaker doing.
Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Yes? You understand?
Mercy.
Mercy.
From
correct.
God.
From God. Yes. Yes. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Not the warriors, not the soldiers, the peacemakers.
My brothers are warriors. Are they not children of God?
We are all children of God. But we should come to seek to be understood and to understand rather than to take and force. Yes? It is the peacemakers.
I think that Alexander Whitaker became like a father to her as he was teaching her about things that she didn't know in her mind, but in her spirit she knew already. And I think he just brought it into focus for her and helped her to understand it. And so once she did understand it, then her relationship with the Lord became more intimate.
The irony is she probably knew the Christian faith better than many British people who had not really been very well instructed in the faith in which they'd been baptized as babies, you know, and grown up in a state church situation where the Christian faith was often very nominal.
There were tribes that believed in God, the Creator is what they called him, or a great giver of life. They did not know Jesus. And she wanted to bring that liberty and that freedom to her people.
Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Yes?
Henricus.
Yes. And once you know the truth, within you, you must share it. You cannot hide, and you cannot turn away, for the Lord will see.
I will share with my people.
That does my heart good to hear.
Still to come in our story of the life of Pocahontas, the Powhatan princess finds love, but not with John Smith, as fairy tale and legend have told the tale, but with another man named John, farmer and businessman John Rolfe. Historians say tobacco saved the Jamestown colony from financial ruin. John Rolfe is the farmer who first cultivated tobacco for the colony with some help from his future wife, Pocahontas.
While Pocahontas was in the care of Reverend Whitaker, she caught the eye of another resident of Henricus, a young entrepreneur and widower named John Rolfe.
He was able to produce a kind of tobacco that became the saving of the colony, Virginia tobacco. So he was an important person commercially for the colony.
She was native to the area. She would have understood the agriculture, and so therefore she would have been important to Rolfe because of him growing the tobacco, the fact that he'd brought up seed, and so therefore it was mixing it with the native tobacco plant. So that would have been important, and the fact is it's tobacco that saved the colony.
You really know your way around the garden.
Of course. I have to.
You're lost.
I think that he may have originally come to her for her knowledge of growing tobacco, but he fell in love with her because she was who she was. And it was truly a love relationship between the two of them.
A deeply pious man, Rolfe was concerned that his motives in courting a native woman may be misunderstood. He wrestled with his convictions, but in the end, he followed his heart and wrote to the governor requesting permission to marry Pocahontas.
To Sir Thomas Dale, Governor, Henricus Settlement. My chief intent and purpose is to strive with all the power of my body and mind for the glory of God and for the conversion to the true knowledge of Jesus Christ, Pocahontas, to whom my hearty and best thoughts are, and have a long time been so entangled and enthralled in so intricate a labyrinth that I was weary of finding a way out. But God has opened the gate and led me by the hand that I might plainly see safe paths to tread. As I proceed, my daily prayers shall be to bring to pass such good that all the world may truly say, "This is the work of God, and it is marvelous in our eyes."
I think it's one of the most remarkable documents in history because how honest he is really with himself and his own motivations. He hints at some of the feelings he was having for her and so on, and even the physical attractiveness. And so a lot of soul searching about that. But I think he was sincere, and I think God was in that.
When I read the letter that he wrote asking for permission to marry Pocahontas, I could feel the integrity of what he was saying. He said, this is not a lustful thing. This is not something that's a political thing or anything. I love her, and we want to be married, and I don't want it to be seen as anything other than a sincere desire to be with the woman I love.
In March of 1614, before Rolfe's letter was delivered, Dale sailed up the Virginia coast to try again to exchange Pocahontas for the pillaged guns. When Dale's group arrived, they were met by two of Pocahontas' half-brothers. Although they were happy to see their sister unharmed, they refused to return the guns. Pocahontas responded with news of her own.
If my father loved me, he would value me more than old swords, guns, and axes. So I will stay with the English, who have always loved me.
It's kind of like the Ruth story. I want to be with you. Your people are my people, and your God is my God. And that's basically what she did.
Pocahontas returned to Henricus, and Reverend Whitaker baptized her with a new name from the Bible, Rebecca, the mother of two nations in Genesis.
It wouldn't be a name that would be given without thought, without Christian thought. So there's a sense in which she is possibly being the person who will join the nations, the Indian nation, the Powhatan nation, and the English nation.
In the Powhatan culture, you would have a name and then you would be given other names according to different things that you had done in your life. Warriors, for example, would be given additional names based on their exploits in war. Naming her Rebecca was taking on a Christian identity.
This young lady is sharp. She knows her place in the world in a lot more ways than we would normally think of. She is coming from two different worlds. And she joins those two worlds together.
I think her relationship with God was a very profound relationship, a very intimate relationship, and that she received instruction from him and she knew exactly who she was working for.
The name Rebecca also echoed the meaning of her given name, Matoaka, or bright stream between the hills.
She ended up being an emissary between two nations and being a part of the birthing of this nation, because she really laid the foundation for that relationship and for that colony to survive.
The settlers owed a great debt of gratitude to Pocahontas for the survival of their colony. When we come back, Pocahontas travels to England and meets with the king. Welcome back as we continue our special Thanksgiving edition of CBN NewsWatch. We pick up with the story of Pocahontas with a baptism, a wedding, and a trip to England.
Just a few days after her baptism, Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married. It was the second marriage for both.
She had already been married. This is never said, but it seems to be one of the few facts that there are, and that's in William Strachey, that she was married to a man called Cucum, about whom we know zero. So, in a sense, she was Rolfe's second wife, and he was her second husband. John Rolfe had been one of the colonists who had been shipwrecked in the Bermudas, and he had a child there, a daughter, called Bermuda, who died in Bermuda, sadly, and his wife also died, his English wife, that came with him.
Chief Powhatan, in a sense, blessed the marriage. He didn't go personally because he had pledged he would never return to the colony. But he did send representatives who were there when she was married. So from the Powhatan standpoint, this was a pledge of peace between the two.
The Governor Dale talks about her in a similar way. He talks about her as a knot to bind the peace.
America's first interracial marriage brought the longest truce the colony had ever known. The so-called Peace of Pocahontas lasted 8 years.
I think everybody saw this as the perfect symbol of the coming together of these two people, this way that there might be some kind of accommodation between the Indian and the English worlds.
Chief Powhatan had developed his federation largely through marriage relationships. You know, he would take as a wife the daughter of a chief of one of the other smaller tribes. And so there is a whole cultural dimension going on here.
I think it was very important that she combined her culture with his culture and showed that it could be successful.
As Rolfe's tobacco enterprise grew, so did his family. Pocahontas had a son named Thomas. The Virginia Company asked them to visit England in order to cultivate new investors for the Virginia settlement. So in the spring of 1616, the Rolfes said goodbye to Reverend Whitaker and set sail for England, where Pocahontas was presented to London society.
We know she was entertained by the Bishop of London, and she attended a masque by Ben Jonson. She was well placed at the masque, which again suggests a degree of status being accorded to her.
While in England, the only known portrait of her was completed, an engraving done by Simon van de Pas.
She is a Powhatan Indian who is in a sense dressed as an English woman of quite high status, and she has in her hand for some reason an ostrich feather, which some people have interpreted as a sign of royalty.
The portrait has evolved much the same way the story of Pocahontas has.
There's a version in which her features have been Europeanized, which is in quite a lot of books. And again, it's interesting the way that even this picture, which is a piece of contemporary evidence of a kind, has been, in a sense, changed or altered in order to make her a more European person.
The visit to England was a resounding success, but Pocahontas would never see her home again.
Someone who'd never left Virginia before. She is suddenly in this huge city in London, exposed to who knows what kind of virus or something that her body had no natural defense for. As soon as they're ready to leave and they're back on the ship and they begin sailing down the Thames, she is so sick that they can't continue the trip.
It is thought that Pocahontas was just 21 years old when she died and was buried in Gravesend, England.
It states in the burial register that she was buried in the chancel of the parish church here, a Virginian lady born, Mrs. Rebecca Rolfe. So that's lovely.
We were blown away as tribal people when we went there and saw Gravesend Church and all of the history that they had on her and how she's still revered in England for saving the colony. And we didn't really understand until we got there how she actually saved us as Powhatan people. We were taught that she betrayed her people. So that was what we believed our whole life. First of all, we believed the lie that John Smith was going to die and that she had saved his life. And then we also believed that she had snuck food into the colony to keep the colonists alive. And we considered them to be our enemy. I see her now as like an Esther, how she went before the king and said, you know, if I die, I die, but please save my people because I want to save yours too.
Remember Alexander Whitaker, the minister who introduced Pocahontas to the Christian faith? We'll tell you what became of him when we come back. Before the break, we heard about the untimely death of Pocahontas, or as she was known to the English, Mrs. Rebecca Rolfe, in March of 1617. Later that spring, her teacher, Alexander Whitaker, also died under tragic circumstances. He drowned in the James River just a few miles from his home. Although he only lived for 32 years, today he's known as the Apostle of Virginia.
He was in Virginia for only about 6 years. I mean, from the time he arrived to the time that he was drowned, but a very critical 6 years.
He is definitely an unsung hero of Virginia. Without Whitaker, you probably would not have had the Rolfe marriage. Without the Rolfe marriage, you wouldn't necessarily have had that 8-year window to establish the colony. The history books have forgotten this man. Without him, would we have had the same relationship that we did with people like Pocahontas? She was obviously very interested in the English, very willing to deal with them.
The fact that she wanted to stay in their society after she was baptized and after she was given her name and after she was married to John Rolfe, it was indicative of the new person she had become through this minister, Whitaker. And so I think that he was a very important part of who she became.
Our Lord's majesty is boundless. Anything is possible through him.
The legacy of Alexander Whitaker and Pocahontas is still alive today.
I see her legacy to us as being who she was. An instrument of reconciliation, an instrument of honor, and an instrument of generosity. She never had hatred in her heart.
We're still intrigued. It's such an extraordinary person to have been and such an extraordinary life to have led.
At the end of the day, I think we can see clearly that God was working in Pocahontas' life, in Alexander Whitaker's life, and John Rolfe's life.
Some believe that there was a greater purpose involved.
The covenant that was made for the land, it was made by an Anglican priest, Reverend Robert Hunt. He planted seeds here for Christianity. He made a covenant for this land. He said that this land would be dedicated to God, that it would be used for His glory, and that the gospel would go from here to every nation of the earth. God is all about covenant, and He's a covenant keeper. And because she was an instrument in His hand to create a covenant, a blood covenant between these two nations, it was really powerful. It was consummated in their marriage, because that was the consummation of the blood covenant between the two of them, for the two nations. And I think that the United States has benefited from and been blessed because of that covenant.
Thanks for joining us for this very special Thanksgiving episode of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can always visit us at cbnnews.com for all the news of the day. From all of us here at CBN News, we wish you a happy and blessed Thanksgiving.